Thank you. Can you hear me? Alrighty. Let me know if you can't, and I'll speak up. Yeah, so today I'm going to talk about the unreasonable effectiveness of grassroots research, a Masakhane story. I need to figure out how to go to the next slide. How do I go to the next slide? The next slide button. Funny that. Thank you for the introduction, so this will be quick. I studied at Pretoria, so it's really cool to be back, and it's really fun to see people who I haven't seen in a very long time. Some of the people in this room taught me how to do AI, which is really cool. A lot of people I used to work with, I lectured here for a little bit, did my master's here. I then worked for Jade Abbott for just under 10 years. There I did a mix of doing software and eventually moved into doing NLP for production. While I was there, I got involved, as many of us did, with the deep learning Indaba𝕏 in the first one and the second one, and got inspired there to start working in NLP for African languages, and through that co-founded an initiative called Masakhane, which is what we're going to talk about today. I'm also on the responsibility board for a company called Cohere. They're a large language model company. That got started in the last couple of years. And yes, recently founded a startup, which you will hopefully hear more about in 2023, called Indaba𝕏. In the meantime, you can go to the website, sign up for the newsletter, and I may also have stickers and zines. There are zines. I'll get the zines for afterwards. So what are grassroots AI movements? And I think this is great, and that it kind of leads on from Vukosi's talk a little bit this morning, is that there are multiple ways in which we can do research. And for me, I was coming from, moved from research. I found that, I was struggling to find, a space and a way for me to do research in a way that I liked. I was working, by myself in a field that was, quite untouched. The collaborators, didn't actually have any collaborators. So it's a very small field. And so I moved into industry, and what I really liked about industry is you could get a lot of feedback on the work you're doing very quickly. People were using your work, very exciting. But that also got tiresome because, it's quite a drudge. You have to produce a lot of features. And at some stage I decided, what would be really fun is if we just did research for fun, and then we're not, described, there's no real agenda that, is being pushed onto you by a university or by funding. And, it's something I really cared about. I was like, maybe this should be in African languages. And so from this came Masakhane, which is what I'm deeming a grassroots AI movement. And the goal of a grassroots AI movement really is to kind of lower the barriers to entry. It's very multidisciplinary, it's inclusive, kind of addresses some of the systemic issues in a particular research area. And so for us, that was African NLP. There was very little happening on the ground. It's collaborative, multi-institutional, holistic, and very, very community focused. And so this is what, through this process of kind of a discovery of what this space could be, and it really, really appealed to me and many others. And so we can see kind of this evolution of AI from AI, I think traditionally has been very much in the realms of large labs, typically from the US, typically from the West. From then, we started ending up with large industrial labs, such as DeepMind. But there have been a spattering of these kind of grassroots initiatives. And they go back as far as 1954, where it was CERN, which was very collaborative. I wouldn't say it was entirely grassroots, a lot more funding behind it. But there you see that every single person who's ever contributed to the work at CERN gets listed on a paper. Other groups that are kind of similar are Santa Fe Institute in 1984, which is a multidisciplinary institute in California. And their big focus is on multidisciplinarity. They kind of go across all spheres of complexity science, also quite related in many cases to AI. And they're also very much an independent lab. And then also kind of underlying out of this is the concept of Ubuntu kind of naturally pushes this idea of like, I am because you are because we are. And let's build this together. And so from these kind of early movements, and as we have a bit of an AI boom kind of around the early 2010s, we see a number of what they call affinity groups emerging. And so these are not really focused on research, they're focused on underrepresented areas in the research space. So women in machine learning, delta analytics, the deep learning Indaba𝕏. is one of these, Queer in AI, Black in AI, Data Science Nigeria. All of these were groups of people coming together saying, we need to address topics that aren't necessarily addressed in the larger group. But from this, we ended up spawning out another type of group, not just these affinity groups where people could find social support, where they could find collaborators who had similar struggles as them, but rather groups where we could focus and actually produce research. And there the idea is that it didn't matter what background you were from, right? So with things like Black in AI and women machine learning, you're really trying to bring people into the research space. Similarly, so with this new group of research groups that are coming out. So this 4.ai was one of the earlier ones. This has now been evolved into Cohere for AI. Similar group of people now working on it. Masakhane was one of the early ones in the space, indigenous AI. Sisonke, which also started by people in this room, which is the healthcare version of Masakhane, so healthcare for Africa. Big Science, which was a massive NLP initiative. Also very big collaborative effort to push forward NLP in a very open way. And so we can see we've had a massive kind of popularity in these very grassroots initiatives. And that's quite wonderful. Many of these were inspired by Masakhane, which I'm very excited to say. But I'm going to ground ourselves for a moment, because we're talking about Masakhane, and Masakhane is fundamentally about language. And we talk a lot about NLP this, NLP that, and these days everything's NLP. I got back into it before, it was cool. Nothing worked, it was great. Now it's a little bit more popular. But fundamentally what kind of lies behind that is language. And I really like this quote by Nanjalis Diabola from her book, Digital Democracy and Analog Politics. Language is not just words, it's constructed self, an orientation towards the world, an attempt to make sense of external phenomena. Language is the hands with which our minds reach into the world and try to make sense of it. This idea that language is something that captures culture. It's something that captures who we are. It's not just words on a page. It's not just signals in a data set. It is a representation of people. And so the loss of language and the loss of languages from across the world represents a loss of culture. It represents a loss of a way of thinking. Also like this quote by Mzizi Kunene in his Anthem of the Decades, the Zulu epic. The naming of things follows a principle of describing their function, appearance, sounds, and relationships, not merely to identify and label them. It was on such a study that one can amass and trace some of the fundamental philosophies of the culture. And so a lot of Mzizi Kunene's work looks at the Zulu language and how fundamentally in the way it's constructed, it describes some of the philosophies of Ubuntu. So when I say Siyabonga, I say, I see you, I see a person. That's what that means. And that is captured in the greeting. So I've been going on about Masakhane. Who are we fundamentally? We're a grassroots research organization. Our mission is to strengthen and spur NLP research in African languages for Africans and by Africans. Our goal is to really shape these towards, towards human dignity, African dignity, well-being and equity. And we do this through inclusivity, through open research, and through multidisciplinarity. It was started at not the IndabaX, but the Indaba in 2017, where I was standing very similar to this and ranting with my arms up to a very different group. And I said, we shall all get together and write a paper. And so we did. And from kind of our collaborations emerged a set of values. So number one, Ubuntu, African centricity. So this idea that instead of looking at the rest of the Western world, what can we start from here and build up from? Ownership, how can we own these technologies? Openness, what can we share? Multidisciplinarity, this idea that everyone has valuable knowledge. So not just because you've got a machine learning background, anyone who's got any knowledge of a language or of a culture can bring something to Masakhane. Kindness, responsibility, data sovereignty, this idea that culture should be able to own their data. And this is quite an interesting topic and can be in contrast with openness, because how do we ensure people can own something and have control of how their data gets shared, but also be open about it. And then reproducibility and sustainability. Sustainability being a really key thing here. And I think Vukosi spoke to this earlier. You cannot have one person doing this. It has to be a group. Through the group action is how you get robustness. If anyone who has founded Masakhane kind of just stopped working on it today, Masakhane would continue. It does. The Slack group and all the initiatives would continue as they are. There's so much going on. And I think that's a real success story in something that should be aimed for in these kind of grassroots AI movements. So I'm going to talk about Masakhane and kind of the group's successes today. And so if we go back to 2019, which is sort of around where we originally started, we can kind of look at what the state of NLP was back then. To really understand what it looked like is to kind of understand what is the full pipeline. I think as technologists, we'd like to pay a lot of attention to this language. As language technologists, we like to pay a lot of attention here. We're really concerned about data sets and AI models. But if we really want to understand the full issue of what happens, we really need to understand the whole process. What happens to data? How did we get there? Who made it? Who annotated it? Who decided to include it? And what was the prerequisites that were needed in order for it to be created? And so it starts off with your content creator. Your content creators are your writers, your playwrights, your authors, your songwriters, your poets, your people who make speeches, the people who write books. And in order to do that, particularly digitally, they need a keyboard to do so. They need an online platform. Through that, they produce original content. The original content can then be annotated. This is something we typically need in NLP. You need some sort of annotation, some sort of label. In order to annotate things, we need dictionaries, we need keyboards, we need cat tools. This produces annotated content. Annotated could also be translated, for example, a whole bunch of annotation techniques. And then we need someone who's going to decide whether or not to include that data in a data set. That would be a curator. So do we include this? In order to do so, we probably need crawlers to find the data sets. We need language ID to determine what language some text might come from and include it. And from that, you output a data set. And this is where language technologists might come in. They would take that data set, they would have some AI toolkits, some preprocessors, some compute, put that together, outputs an AI model. And then we'd have, have some evaluator that could be an automatic or human metrics, might be some linguistic knowledge, and there'd be feedback to the language technologists. And the problem with African NLP, at least in 2019, is almost none of this existed. Very, very scarcely. So the data sets weren't open. The data sets didn't exist because the content creators weren't creating digital content. The content creators weren't creating digital content, not even only because keyboards didn't exist for certain languages, but because there was a kind of lack of demand due to colonialism to create digital content in those languages. You see this kind of chicken and the egg story, where you don't actually have data online because people aren't going to go look online for data, or for text, for writing, for art in their language, because they know it's not going to be there. And so it's a really hard problem to solve. And so we don't have original content. It's hard to annotate because we don't have the dictionaries. Crawlers and language IDs didn't work for many African languages. There are a couple of great papers on this. We don't have preprocessors, standard tokenizers. The tokenizers that work for many languages didn't work for African languages. Compute is very scarce on the continent in comparison, particularly if we look at the scale required for the rest of the world. And then, once we built an AI model, in order to evaluate that, we needed metrics. And many of the metrics that are built for English or other languages don't even apply. We don't actually know what they mean. We can run them on our models, but they're not necessarily useful pieces of data. And so we've got this real problem. We had this real problem. And so what's been really kind of encouraging is in the past couple of years, we've done a lot of work, and the community's made huge progress in changing this. And so there have been keyboards for languages which had scripts that didn't have keyboards. That is a massive problem. Dictionaries are starting to appear, particularly online ones, starting to be published. They're starting to get language ID correct. Data sets are being produced. Vikosi mentioned a bunch of them earlier. And we have some AI models. We still have work to do. We still need a lot more original content. We still need more processing tools and compute. We still need to work on this kind of evaluation component. We don't know how well the models are doing without human knowledge. And so how did we do that in such a short time? What were the key directions? that were very helpful for Masakhane. And Masakhane has done lots and lots of little things, but I've kind of managed to group them into these 4 components. Number 1, intentional high quality data collection. This is really weird in the NLP world because NLP really loves just scraping stuff and then maybe adding some labels to it. But intentional high quality data collection is a really valuable step, and we'll talk about what we did in that space. Participatory research, so this idea of building together, fundamental to Masakhane's kind of philosophies and approach, methodology, in a way that was quite unique. Multilingual African models, so there are a lot of work in multilinguality. If you've been in the NLP space in the last couple of years, you'll notice everyone's trying to add more and more languages to their large language model to say it's got 300 languages now. Look how multilingual it is. But what we found is that centering those on African data and training them from scratch just on African data could actually show quite larger performance improvements. And then lastly, and most obviously and often most ignored, is hyperparameter tuning. And this is something I hop on when I do my industry talks at ML Ops, is hyperparameter tuning is the easiest way to get very large benefits in many spaces. And we find that when models have traditionally been trained for English, where you have loads and loads and loads of data, maybe you don't need to rebuild an entirely new model or come up with a whole new strategy. Maybe you just need to try and train a smaller model and see if that actually works better. And often it does. So some of the research we've done, and this is to give you a glance, a high-level glance for those of you who want to come into the NLP space, which I invite everyone to come join. Masakhane is you. It's the people in this room. It's the people who belong to academic institutions. It's the people who belong to industry. It's the people who are students who are looking to get into either of these spaces or want to just do this for fun, whatever they might be. And this paper was kind of one of those key ones of that. This was participatory research for low resource machine translation, a case study in African languages. And here we were able to publish 47 translation models for 35 African languages. They weren't very good, but that wasn't the point. The point was that no one could train these, no one could evaluate them, no one could understand how well they worked. And so many of these languages had never been published before in the NLP setting. And so this was a first for many of those languages. And as you can see, part of our group, we've got 50 authors, approximately, the first author being the for all symbol to represent the community. And this also stands for very much the Masakhane philosophy. Some of the struggles that we have kind of indicated the early problems that were in the space. So the only data set that was available for all these languages was something called the Jehovah's Witness data set. It's JW300, which has been taken down due to copyright issues. So that's a huge issue for us, which we're working on. And it was, that's predominantly religious data. But that also means that whatever you train it on isn't actually going to generalize to. And so during the time of COVID, some people who didn't really understand how machine learning worked emailed us and said, hey, could you translate these COVID-19 surveys with your models? And we're like, that's not going to work. But thankfully, because the people who train the models actually speak the languages, we can do a post-edit for you and get those surveys back to you, but we're actually going to use it as a test for how good or bad the models are. And from there, we were able to determine a number of qualitative issues with the models. Many of the things, we called it religification, where you'd have words that, you might have Canada became Canaan and a bunch of other things would come in because we were trained on religious domains. And so this shows that, you really need to have data that is really representative. And kind of in light of that, what really made it participatory was this, idea of authorship, which we chained. So authorship under Harvard Medical School, which is a traditional one that I think everyone bases them on, is that everyone needs to write the manuscript. Coordinators are explicitly excluded. You have to substantially direct intellectual contribution to the work, whatever that means, and it doesn't acknowledge data or data collectors. Whereas the Masakhane authorship model, you had to just add one of the following. You added a result, and that means you probably trained a model, you gave us that result. You provided data, you provided code, you provided an evaluation of some of that. You provided an analysis, strategy, writing, coordination, lived experiences. These were all very valid means because without those, we couldn't have written the paper. So instead of seeing participants as data subjects, objects that need to be studied, they're part of the process and everyone becomes a researcher. What was really cool about this paper is we run the Wikimedia Foundation Research Award of the Year in 2021. They were being awarded by the head of Wikimedia Foundation himself for our contribution to language building, which is something very close to Wikimedia's heart, which we're very proud of. But this goes further than that. Masakhane, which is know our names, I'll go into it a bit later. And here we've got a community annotated data set, also participatory evaluated, so a group of people evaluating it, around 50 authors once again, and there we did 10 African languages. Once again, to the small, localized, high-quality data set. This paper is fantastic. A few thousand translations go a long way, leveraging pre-trained models for African news translation. And so what the team did here is built up a corpus of 16 African languages in a new domain, which was news. And what they were able to do is effectively fine-tune one of these very big, some of the very big multilingual translation models, using as little as 2,000 sentences, and were able to get massive performance improvements. And they attributed this to the high qualityness of the data. It might be small, but because it's such high quality and because we had such a powerful multilingual model, it was able to perform very good translations. Similarly, we've got another one, small data, no problem, exploring the viability of pre-trained multilingual language models for low resource languages. They call it Afriberta. It was trained on less than a gigabyte of text. And if you've looked at more recent AI models, it's terabytes and petabytes of text that traditionally they get trained on. And once again, they managed to get very, very, very good results. This one I really love. We have one of the authors in the audience. The idea of this culture and community and technology. So once again, this participatory approach. So participatory translation of Washiwambo, which is a Namibian language, towards culture preservation with language technology. What was really beautiful here is the data creation process. It was that. It wasn't data scraping, it wasn't data annotation, it was creation from scratch, where they had a participatory workshop with a group of students, people who just graduates, people who job seekers from different backgrounds with different expertise come together and work on building a data set and translating it. The goals being, we could actually get some data sets out of it, but also kind of bridge generational knowledge gaps, provide these socioeconomic opportunities off of language technology creation, and then ended up with a data set of 5,000 sentences, which they could train a model off of. What's really cool here, once again, back to this idea of how they created the data, is they started with names, seed words, wildlife, agriculture. They'd ask the participants what their interests were and then ask them to write sentences on that. They had a situation of Ask a Veteran, where they had a number of veterans of the Namibian War, people whose stories have not been told, gave them a call and asked them questions about that. They brought in things around the human-environment relationship, societal challenges, free writing, profession-based writing, and did this as a group collaboratively over the space of just a week, just 8 days. And if you can look, it's really terrible, I probably should have made this a lot bigger. If you look at the translation, so let's look at what's a nice one. Look at the first one. We've got a prediction before fine-tuning. So this was a multilingual model before they'd fine-tuned it on the 5,000 sentences, and after fine-tuning. The original reference sentence, so this is what it should be translated to, or something similar. If you respect elders, you will have a long life. The prediction before fine-tuning is, thou shalt speak to the wicked, thou shalt speak to the wicked. Multilingual models, everyone. After fine-tuning on this data set, it says, if you respect parents, you will have a long life. So elders and parents, but that's pretty damn good. And you can see through this very localized data creation and this very specific data creation, they were able to translate these in-domain and culturally relevant topics a lot more effectively. Another one, and this is back to this parameter tuning and best practices. There's a lot of research, and sometimes what we need to do in order to make the best model is just go get the best practices, go do the fine tuning, go figure out what the best optimizers are. And so to gather your data in the correct way. And so there's this great piece of work by Perez Ogayo called Building African Voices, which did text-to-speech. And they were just doing that. They were following all the best practices, and they were able to produce a fantastic model, text-to-speech model for her language, Kenyan language Leo, with also just a couple hours of audio. Next. Cool, Masakhane web. We decided to throw some of these on the web. These are the ones that were trained initially, just to show that you can play with them. They're all just for research purposes. And we, I think, also gather data to understand. You can report how good or bad the translations are. Did a little bit of an analysis afterwards to figure out how we can improve it. So this is kind of the state of this. This will be upgraded actually in the future. We're adding a whole bunch of other projects from our more recent Lacuna Fund grants to actually add different types of translation, including translation of scientific papers, or an attempt to do that. And a little bit depth into Masakhane, which I mentioned a little bit earlier, assuming I can go next on the slides. So Masakhane was the first one. It was 10 languages, and then they expanded that into 20 languages. And we produced another data set. And so for the first one, we had a couple of, you can see we had quite good coverage of the African continent with our 10 languages. Quite good being, it doesn't look great. That's better than most data sets would be able to say. But then we still ended up with a number of issues, well, not issues, interesting things from there. So for example, in Amharic, they use non-Latin script. NER stands for named entity recognition. So what you want to do there is you want to be able to identify names, places, people, things. So there you can see it's identifying 18 years, Nigeria, Zang, Kuno. And so yeah, so non-Latin script. Kinyarwanda is very morphologically rich. A lot of the South African languages have the same property. It makes them very hard to do NLP on. Extensive use of diacritics. Diacritics are little umlauts or deeltekens, or whatever we want to call them. So Yoruba uses them quite extensively, for example. And so these are often quite different to languages such as English, which primarily this works on. There's some results, which you can go look up. And so I'll talk a little bit about the challenges, because we've spoken about a lot of the joys of doing this, but what are the challenges of trying to do kind of collaborative, participatory, grassroots research? And Masakhane was just entirely, the first one was done entirely by volunteers. It was very time consuming. There was a language barrier just between people on the team. And there, for a while, Masakhane was largely working in English, but when you start engaging with large amounts of West Africa and Central Africa, and even North Africa, a lot of it's very French-based. We barely even touch, the Lusophone parts of the continent, which is Portuguese-speaking areas. And so the people, the principal investigator only spoke English, and so now we had to figure out someone who could translate to French, and then that could translate to whoever's actually annotating. It's very difficult to verify the accuracy of non-Latin scripts like Amharic, because a lot of the tools didn't support the script. Difficult to enforce working on a task because distributed and volunteered and work offline. You can, the collection, the initial data sets can be quite small, and it's quite hard to manage because you've got lots of people. We had, I think, 3 or 4 people on each team who then had someone, a coordinator that was managing them, and the scale was quite difficult. But because we had such an enthusiastic team, we still delivered 10 out of the 12 languages we originally wanted to do. And having a conference deadline was highly motivating. So if you ever want to do work, pick a conference deadline. Highly motivating for everyone to work on the project. This is just a general thing for doing any group research. And the last bit is the idea that all annotators are authors, right? This is a great entry point for people who are looking to get into AI and don't know how. First start with annotation, work with the people, help train the models, use it as a learning platform to how to write a paper. This is a great way to get involved. I'll skip all this due to various time things. And so you can see we increased the geographic diversity of Masakhane significantly more to include a number of extra groups. And so a lot of the Southern African languages got included there. I thought I'd taken these out. I will leave those for you to go read another paper. So here are some future data sets you can expect from Masakhane. So current ones, as I've mentioned, we've got the Mafan data set, we've got the Masakhane ones, both of them number 1 and 2, Niger Center, which is a sentiment classification for 4 Nigerian languages, and ANTC, which is a news topic classification for 5 data sets. Future plan is we've got a parts of speech data set that's coming out of actually Masakhane. We've got decolonized science, which is the one I mentioned, parallel corpus for African research for 6 languages. One of them being, for the 2 southern ones are isiZulu and Sepedi. OpenQA, it's a Q&A data set. We've got a sentiment data set, a hate speech data set. We've got a parallel corpus for tech and medical domains, one for intent detection, and a voice one for speech corpuses. And many of these are being funded by Lacuna or Google in the next year. So thanks to the Lacuna Fund, which was also mentioned earlier. And that's really helpful because gathering these data sets can be quite expensive. So let's end on the community. I don't know how much longer I have, probably not that much. The exciting parts. We have over 1,000 participants, 25 African countries, 40 African languages, 40 GitHub contributors, over 40 publications, actually over probably around 150 at this point, because mostly due to having three conference workshops. We've recently got notified that we will be having the 4th one next year at iClear in Rwanda, which we'll be publishing soon. So if you really want to come to a very cool conference and would like to get involved with NLP, I would suggest applying, submitting something to that. The deadlines will likely be kind of February, March next year. And what's great about this is you'll get to go to Rwanda. You'll also get to go to one of the largest AI conferences in the world. It will be one of the biggest meetups we'll have of many of the people working in NLP on the African continent. So I invite everyone to kind of join our Slack and watch out, because there will be a couple of notifications on this in coming weeks. Community is very broad, mostly in STEM, but we do have a lot from humanities and business and finance. And we'd like to grow that further. Diverse in terms of gender, age groups, and formal education, quite a wide spread. A lot of language diversity, so most people speak 2 or 3 languages, many 4, which is not surprising. I thought this was a skipped slide. I think that's what happened, but you can still go here. A lot of our research is captured on this map from all over the continent. As I mentioned, here are the 3 workshops, and there'll be a 4th one. We have a number of partner institutions, not all of them are actually listed here. So Vukosi's group, the Data Science for Social Impact group, is really good, great. SADLR, who are the South African Digital Language Resources group. They're based at Potch University. So if you need African language data, you can get them there. Makerere AI Lab, they're based in Uganda at Makerere University. IRCAI, which is the International Research Center of Artificial Intelligence. Rail Lab in WITS, and CIPIT, which is the Center for Intellectual Property in Kenya. So yeah, there's a number of our funders. This is my favorite slide. This is community health. We just looked at all our emojis from Slack, and as you can see, number 1 is the hearts. We're a very loving community, so if you feel like you don't you feel scared to join, you'll see everything's very positive and fluffy. The next one's celebration, because we like to celebrate a lot. We love giving hugs and very excited about things and saying thank you. So that's an indication of kind of where we're at. And so if you'd like to get involved in this wonderful community that's doing lots of work and will continue to do much more, please join our Slack and mailing list. If that QR code does not work, there is one link on the website. You don't need any NLP experience. We all started with very little NLP experience. I was just chatting to people earlier, like when I started, I didn't have any NLP experience either. And I hadn't really written many research papers. And so this, getting involved, with this community and building this community was my introduction to research, really. And it was an introduction to the world of research that I really enjoyed, one that was communicative, one that was, collaborative, and that took away the kind of darkness of being a solo researcher, which I really hated. So yeah, thank you very much. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your Indaba.
We actually have about 10 minutes for questions. So if anyone has questions for Jade, yeah, 10 minutes. Thumbs jump. Yes, okay. Yeah.
I was just wondering, you mentioned multi-level African language models. I was wondering on what data those things are there any available for social media data?
So the data that we used was largely news data for most of them. And that's based on a couple of corpuses we said, news, Wikipedia, some religious data. If you look at some of the papers, you'll see we outline exactly where we got them from. We don't have any social media data because typically you don't actually get access to the social media data that's actually been locked off for many, many years. And so to get access, at least in Masakhane's way, we publish a lot of the data. And so, you can only get specific licenses to get access to, I think even Twitter's data. Facebook you can't get. Twitter's data you can sometimes get, but only under certain research licenses. Which we've never been down that road. I know Vukosi's done a lot in that space. However, I hear there's been a Twitter leak of a bunch of data, so if people want it unethically, you can probably go get it. But yeah, so it's fundamentally been religious news, and I think some people had access to certain radio transcripts and things like that, which have been slowly coming up. That's what being involved on the ground, at least, has been, having someone who knows the region, who lives there, has been able to kind of trudge up various smaller archives to put those together. Although there is one, so the Nigerian sentiment analysis one, it was Twitter, but you can't actually, the data set doesn't consist of the tweet, it consists of a link to the tweet. And then you can go try download the tweets when you actually compile the data set, because it's actually illegal to have the tweet itself, but you can have the link to the tweet. So that's how the one Nigerian group have done it. And I think Vukosi's group have also done it in a number of projects. Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much. So my question is this. I know that in the last 1-2 years, Google to Google crowdsource have been trying to build some of the biggest language and database, and they have a lot of text translation, voice donation, and all of that. So my question is this: is there a way the research community can collaborate with tech giants like this to be able to solve some of the problems we think we are currently facing in terms of data collection and validating the data?
So many billions. My problem with what they do is a lot of it we do under their terms. When we work with Google, we work under Google's terms. Google might own that data. Even if they publish that data, which they, depending on which part of the crowdsourcing you're working with, they're not going to. It's their data. And so on their terms, I mean, they've approached Masakhane before, and we've worked with Google many times. But sometimes they say, cool, come work on our tool, sign this NDA, do all this work, and then we license the data. It's our data. And I'm like, no, you don't sign NDAs. Not with you, sorry. So there's not with you, not really with any. And so my concern is that these big tech giants are like, I don't know as much as, I don't feel like it's collaboration when it's done in that way. I feel like it's collaboration when they come to us and say, what is it that you want to be working on? What are the languages that you care about? What is it that we can fund that? And then you decide what to do with that. That is what they need to be doing. As the group in power, that's what they should be doing. Additionally, they should be investing in the startups on the continent that are actually working in that space, in the areas which they're working in, instead of trying to do it themselves. Often they're not doing it themselves. You say like the validation and the verification, they don't know how to do that, right? Whatever they're paying you won't be what the value is worth. So either we give it freely and we give it openly, we keep it to ourselves and we charge a lot of money for it. And we ensure that we find ways in the future of getting true value out of the data we're giving, because these models don't exist without the data. We must not forget that. We give the language data, they take the language data, they scrape the language data, they do whatever they want with it. And I say they, I'm talking about they, the big, gigantic, big tech consortium of that upset me all the time, for no good reason, sometimes good reasons. But yeah, I just think we should be cautious as Africa on how we engage. And when we do engage, I think we should try to put ourselves in a position of power. Be like, cool, let's engage on our terms. We're using a tool. What's the license for that tool? How is it open? Is it open source? Can other people use it? What happens to the data when it gets in there? How can we control what that data gets used to train? Where does it go? These are the sort of questions we need to be asking big tech about what happens to the data and where it might go. And so Google crowdsourcing is, they've been doing initiatives like that for years and years and years. I don't know the full in-depth matter, but I do know that when we've asked them to be like, hey, let's speak to some of your researchers on your team and exactly what they want to do with this data, they go silent. And that tells me everything I need to know. So that's my bleak answer.
So I have a three-part question, I guess. I hope I can remember everything as I'm asking. The first one was I kind of appreciated the point you made about language being, paraphrasing, a vehicle for culture and a person. And so I was wondering, in the context of that, what constitutes a good data set? Because the success you were able to achieve with one of these papers was you said you had a good data set. And so I was kind of curious as to what constitutes a good data set. And then the second question related to that is, what is the intersection between constructing a good data set and the involvement of people, as you've done now, where people collaborate in constructing the data set? And then finally, what do you think, how do you feed that back into how language models are trained more generally beyond just the African languages you're considering?
Okay, so the first question was, what is a good data set? Okay, I'm very bad at multi-part questions. So what is a good data set and why is it a good data set? So the example I'll give is a paper that I didn't actually list, but it was really worth looking up. We did a data audit of papers that, data sets, these very large data sets that claimed, my mic is annoying, apologies. Very large data sets that claim to have loads and loads of multilingual models, loads and loads of languages. And we looked at this long tail. We call it the long tail of low-resource languages because there's a very large number of languages that have very little data. And we sampled parts of the data set and said, cool, you know, what is in this data set that they say is there? And quite often, and so this is a very low bar for good at this point. Quite often, it was nonsense. It was a random set of characters. It was pornographic. It was, you know, random addresses, private information, and completely different language, you know. And so the things that they'd actually labeled as the data set weren't even data from that language. So step one is let's have a bar of like in the language that it says it's in. I think the next component of what a good data set would be is something that is representative of the use case in which it would be used. So representative of the people, representative of the culture. Now, while that's quite hard to measure, the only way we can do that is by gathering more data and testing the model on that and saying, does it work in that use case, and actually going out and doing user testing. for me, that's a good data set. So something that's been trained on religious data from many, many years ago very rarely generalizes to anything else. And so while that might be helpful, is it good data? No. Often it's also very outdated data. The language has evolved. And so that data is no longer relevant. So I think maybe time relevance would be another example of what good is. And then, having good, still I'd say is very use case dependent. So if your sample is, if you're looking at Twitter, then Twitter is going to have a very different type of language to something that's got really good grammar. But if your use case is doing something with Twitter, then that's a good data set. So yeah, I'd say use case driven, and then very fundamental basics of like, is this in the language? So that was the first question. The second question was?
The intersection between constructing data sets and
The intersection?
Yeah.
I mean,
just scraping data.
As opposed to the scraping data, yeah. I think, so, I mean, that's exactly what the one paper did. It was very much about data creation, where it was, let's build that up, and then people decide what goes in, and then like it's the population generating the data. I think what advantage that gives is that it allows things that aren't represented on the internet to be represented. So number one, the internet is very American white male, and between a certain age bracket too. Whereas, most of the cases we're looking at are not going to be that. So you're just not going to simply find the data that's there. And so it's important for it to get generated. I think there's also the types of sentences that will get generated, the diversity. You can guide that a lot more. What is the story? What are the aspects that we want to focus on? And a lot of what Wilhelmina Nokota, who ran that, focused on was what are the aspects of society that you wanted to ensure she captured. And so in that way, there's some argument as to whether you should or shouldn't do that in AI. But she wants to ensure that women's stories were told where they were normally told. She wanted to ensure that side of the Libyan war story was told. And that way she can kind of guide the data set creation. And I think that's also very intentional, whereas when you scrape, we're not intentional. We're about as intentional as selecting what addresses we're going to. Okay, well, maybe we'll ignore Reddit and then end up with some nonsense from another website. And so when you've got this massive data, it's too big to even interrogate often. Scraped data is hard to interrogate. It's too big. So I think those are I don't know if that's clarified anything more. Your last question was,
how do you
how do we bring that back in?
Yeah, like is there still a use case for saying, is there still a use case to say let's do scraping to train models for which languages, the language where the data set abounds? Or does it make sense to take a step back and say, well, let's reevaluate the whole process of how we construct the data set for training because we want to capture certain artifacts that's in the language?
I think both have academic and practical merit. So I see, what the Masakhane data set did is we took, or data set project, is there was a pre-trained model. It was one of the multilingual models. It was a good multilingual model because when we fine-tuned on the small amount of good data, it performed very well. So clearly there still is value in scraping and building these large language models. I think what needs to still be explored a lot in the space is when we do that, how are we still capturing some of the biases? What are we losing? What are we gaining from transitioning from this model and then fine-tuning on the smaller data set? Are we able to actually circumvent some of the biases by doing that and some of the problems that are kind of underlying the original language model? But I really like the idea of standing back always. I think it's always useful to stand back and think, can we just do this? I think it is hard and need to go the way that we build language models. And I think there is a little bit of this. There's a couple of years ago at ACL, there was someone who was looking at back to kind of more knowledge base ways, looking at language models as a graph, right? Very different type of way of thinking it, far more interrogate it, works much better with low resource languages. And I thought that was still just a really interesting resource direction. And it was still performing pretty well. It was 3 years and 4 years in AI time, basically a century. But I still I'm still glad that people are taking that approach and standing back and being like, okay, this is fun, but let's do something else because this, you know, this parrot is a little bit annoying. A lot of issues with it. Yeah. Yeah, that's my 3 questions. Sorry, they were really long to answer.
Just raise.
Hi, Jade. Great talk. So I'm curious, are there any efforts towards maybe some data sets for fake news detection or combating misinformation or disinformation? Has there been anything in that direction yet from us?
I think the hate speech, yes. So there's a Nigerian hate speech data set. Hold on, let me go back. I think we're also doing a Masakhane wide one too, which has got a lot more. In terms of misinformation, Fokosi's group have released 1 or 2 from here and there, or they're not publicly available, I think, because there might be some issues around copyright there. But they're on Zenodo, so you can contact them to get it. But you probably know that. So there we go. The 2 hate speech ones. The main issue is Afri-hate. So 18 African languages. Whoa, I didn't even realize they were going for 18. That's what I love about Masakhane. I don't even know what's happening half the time because there's so much happening. So we clearly got this one approved. Every time I look, it's like, oh, there are more. I'm stressed for them. Hate speech, yeah. So there's one, that's the one I've seen that I know of that's actually working in that space. Misinformation, there's a big push to do it. I think some people are working on a couple of them for Ethiopia. So I think I heard, I can't remember if that was a rumor or if it was something Timid wanted to do for the Ethiopian languages, because there's large issues with misinformation in Ethiopia. And Facebook, for instance, was completely unable to combat it because they did not understand what the languages were or how they worked. So hopefully there's stuff on there, but it's a super important one. And misinformation is really hard in text because often it comes with, it's actually embedded in images. So we need to work do a bunch of interesting things.
Hi. I wanted to ask, so of the languages that you noted and have over the data set, could you note the aspects of the educational purposes that they can be used for teaching and also in early learning?
So actually one of our next big data sets that we're looking to get funded, we just need to confirm the funding, is specifically for that, particularly for education and particularly for primary and early childhood education. So right now, very few of them are targeted at that. The closest in the education space we've got is in the decolonized science space, where now we're translating work by African researchers that was published in English back into African languages. So that's a very exciting one that the data set will come up early next year. But yeah, we haven't done those directly. While some of these I think could apply somewhat, I think it's better to get involved and see what's happening as soon as we get some funding for specifically creating a data set for early childhood. Because I think it's always been, I mean, part of the reason Masakhane was created was to be able to do that data set and do data sets like it. So yeah, so nothing right now. I wouldn't necessarily consider using these. I think some of these might still be useful. Parts of speech data sets can be useful for building anything in NLP. The intent detection can be useful. Translation can be useful to help these sort of things. But because very few of them were directly in like early childhood education domain, it'll be interesting to see how they work. They do some really good work on the Mafund MT data set in that paper, where they did domain adaptation. They use a number of domain adaptation techniques to see, can we adapt from the news domain to another domain? And so maybe there's also some work that can be done there. But once again, when we're focusing on early childhood, you're dealing with very fresh minds. And so I think that's a great place to build a data set that's, and a tool that's perfectly made. And I would actually, these days, I like the idea of building data sets not for data set sakes, but you're building them with a tool in mind. So if I look at many of the ones that Masakhane have done, NER and POS power most chatbots. Same with Q&A and intent detection, for example. Hate speech, very clear use cases. Decolonize Science was a very, like, let's build a tool for scientific journalists so they can write about science in African languages. Voice is also, kind of a standard one. And so I think we're moving more and more towards this use case driven data set development because it grounds us, right? We're not saying, oh, let's create a data set because every other language has a data set for that thing. No, let's create a data set because it actually applies to a problem that we've got. Yeah.